evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook. Appreciate your being there this evening, and I think you're going to find tonight's show and the next show that we're going to tape, because we're going to do a series here on a topic that I think you're going to find very interesting, very useful, and potentially very helpful for you and your family. Because with me this evening is Tiffany Mikles, who is the owner of Dementia Care Coaching here in the Santa Clara Valley. And first, Tiffany, I want to thank you for being here this evening.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
And I wanted to facilitate that introduction and then go back to the audience and really give you a sense of what we're going to talk about. This area of dementia, Alzheimer's, whatever you want to call it, that has an impact on individuals, especially those of us who are in the boomer generation these days, is an ever-growing circumstance and condition and a challenge. And I had the privilege of meeting Tiffany and learning more, not just about what is going on here, but what the impact is on families and how you can actually do something positive to care for not just the individual, but the families that are going through this sort of circumstance. So it's a pleasure to have you here. So tell us a little bit, Tiffany, about how you got involved in this kind of a thing.
I actually got involved many years ago when my grandfather got lost in New Orleans.
Lost in New Orleans?
Yes.
Some people would think that's a good thing.
This was back maybe in the late 80s, and I didn't understand why he would be lost and how that came about. So I started looking into it and found out that people with Alzheimer's do get lost, and it was most unfortunate. And then I went on to take some jobs in memory care units, and I realized that the people in memory care units, now the units are doing pretty well for the most part.
In terms of the way they're
cared for
the patient?
Yes. But it was the families that were still in distress, and they were in my office and asking questions and worried and concerned about how they're visiting and should they take their loved one home? Is this the right place for their loved one? All those questions. So I left my last job and started Dementia Care Coaching for the families.
Cool. I can see how that, and we've talked a little bit about this, but I can see the challenge there. I have several friends who have a family member that this is a situation for, and they're under a lot of stress. And it's amazing. So let's talk a little bit about something. I want to step back for a couple moments, because we use these terms, dementia, we use Alzheimer's, we use them interchangeably. Something that you had mentioned to me at one point was that dementia is a term that is more of a blanket term that is used for more than one thing. And is it appropriate and good for us to understand exactly what the playing field looks like here? Yeah,
I can explain the difference between the word dementia and the word Alzheimer's disease, because those are used interchangeably. Dementia in itself is not a diagnosis, and it's not a disease. It's just simply a description of what's happening. So it's all the symptoms that we all know very well: forgetfulness, repeating themselves, agitation, some combativeness. Those kind of symptoms mean that someone has dementia.
Okay.
When someone has dementia, they need to go to the doctor and be seen and get some diagnosing done, and then the doctor will go through a series of tests, many tests actually, and look to see if it's something reversible that can be possibly fixed, like maybe untreated depression, two medications that don't belong together, lack of vitamin B12. All those things might cause someone to have these symptoms that we call dementia. And when we treat those, the dementia goes away. That's called reversible dementia. If it's not that, then the doctor is probably going to move on to what I refer to as situational dementias, like a previous head injury or multiple head injuries like boxers have, or now we're looking at our football players. Also, alcoholism will cause dementia. Some strokes will sometimes cause what we call vascular dementia. So those are kind of situations that happen in your life, and If there's nothing like that, then the doctor will look at diseases that are actually in the brain.
Okay.
And there's many diseases that will cause dementia, like frontotemporal disease and Lewy bodies and Pick's disease. And
there's a bunch of them, right?
One of them is Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease will cause you to have the symptoms of dementia.
We hear more about Alzheimer's. That is the more common term that I hear in the media and everything. And you mentioned that there are these other, let's separate them out. There's the circumstances that you can correct. There's the injuries that you may have had that cause it, but there are a number of diseases that result in this. Are these other diseases as common? Or is it just that, we hear Alzheimer's more because that's the most, that has the highest frequency of occurrence?
Yes, it has the highest frequency. It makes up, there are over 100 reasons why someone might get dementia.
Wow.
Not 100 diseases, but 100 reasons.
Right.
Alzheimer's does make up about 50% of those.
Really?
So that's why we hear a lot about it. There's a lot of research on it. There's a lot of scientists working on it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money being spent to come to some, cure or something like that, because about 50% of the people that have dementia is caused by Alzheimer's disease.
Caused by Alzheimer's. Right. And we don't know, and you see the stuff in the papers sometimes too. They're talking about research and whatever, and I kind of am curious about that. My wife's in medicine; she's a registered nurse, so some of this stuff interests me. And I guess they're checking all kinds of things. Is there a genetic component? Is there an autoimmune deficiency component? There's all sorts of things, but I guess nobody really knows just yet what is the precipitating factor for the illness.
Right. Right.
So does that mean that it's not curable then? At least as far as we know at this stage of the game.
Right.
Is it preventable?
No, not at this point, but like you said, they're getting closer and closer. And there are two different types of Alzheimer's disease. There's what we call early onset Alzheimer's disease. It comes before the age of 65, and that is genetic. Okay. And then there is normal onset Alzheimer's disease that comes 65 years old or older.
Right.
And that is not genetic, and we don't know.
Got it.
It's still the mystery.
One of the main reasons I wanted to ask you to be on the show was to talk a lot more about what we can do for the families, what people can do in caring for someone that may have this. But before we go into that, you actually had sent me an image file, and I'd like to have us take a look at that, because, and I think the guys are going to be able to put it up on screen, because I think it's useful for people to understand. One of the things that I've come to appreciate is that if you can have some visceral and maybe even visual understanding of what's going on in any kind of a circumstance, you can do something about it. If you know what's broken in your car, you can fix it, okay? This is not something that can be fixed, but it's something that we may be able to have a better sense of what's going on. So, guys, if we can put that image up, and tell us a little bit, Tiffany, about what it is that we're seeing here.
Well, these images I find are very helpful for caregivers. The top image is of a healthy brain. It is 3 pounds, and that's what your brain looks like and my brain looks like. The outside cortex is nice and tight and touching. The two sides of the brain are touching. It is full. It is healthy. And an important part of it is looking down at the bottom. You see the hippocampus, and it's a very large part of the brain. It's big, it's fat, it's healthy. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The bottom brain is overall much smaller, and it's beginning to atrophy. The cortex is pulling apart. The two sides of the brain are no longer touching, so sometimes information cannot be travel back and forth in the brain and be interpreted well. There are actually holes in the brain, and these holes are different for every person with Alzheimer's disease. The holes are in different spots, but the big important thing for families and caregivers especially is the hippocampus in the bottom brain is significantly smaller than your hippocampus.
That's that area where we're seeing the open gap there.
Not the open gap,
well, but next to it.
Next to it,
yeah,
yes.
okay.
Yes. And so the job of the hippocampus is to make new memory.
Mm-hmm.
So memory is what we do every single day. You remember what you had for lunch.
Right.
That was your hippocampus working.
Mm-hmm.
Our conversation tonight, it's your hippocampus working so that you'll be able to tell your friends tomorrow what we talked about. But you see, the brain at the bottom has a shrunken hippocampus, and therefore that person is not making new memory. That person is not able to remember what they had for breakfast
Mm-hmm.
or what they spoke about a half an hour ago or maybe even 5 minutes ago.
Wow.
So being that they can't remember what they just talked to you about, they may repeat it. And then families...
And they don't realize they're repeating it, do
No, they don't. Because that's the whole thing. They're just not making a memory that they just had that conversation with you and therefore don't know that they're repeating.
You know, I mentioned this to you before the show, but I'm going to mention it here too because I can relate to that from a personal experience. I had an occurrence of what's called temporary global amnesia.
Mm-hmm.
I was away from home. My family and I were up in Seattle visiting my sister and brother-in-law. Something happened, and there's a gap of several hours that just isn't there for me. And when I talked to my wife, she says, you asked me this question how many times or why we're here, what we're doing, what time is it, what day is it. I have no recollection of that.
Right.
That's kind of what's going on for these people, but it's
Right.
not temporary.
Right.
Wow,
Right.
scary.
And so I try to tell, you know, and the other thing about the memory is they have memory from very long ago.
Right.
Because their brain was healthy, like the top brain, when they were 40 or 30 years old, and their hippocampus was healthy and made memories and stored them. So they are telling you today those memories that they have stored from long ago when their hippocampus was healthy and made a memory.
Got it.
And so I refer to this is a disability that they have, and that people with an amputated leg, we don't expect them to run up a bunch of stairs if they only have one leg, and we can see that every single day. It's reminded, we see the reminder that they have an amputated leg. But we don't see this disabled brain.
Right.
Because it's behind their pretty face. And I think if we could see this disabled brain, we would probably understand the disease a little bit better.
And at least in the beginning, until it gets very advanced, you're not going to be able to look at someone and say, there's clearly something wrong with that person
Right.
from a standpoint of what's happening to their brain.
Right.
Is that correct?
Right. Especially for the dementias that come on early in life, like in the 40-year-old, 50-year-olds. People don't expect them to have dementia.
Right.
And you can't see that their brain is disabled. So,
Right.
yeah.
So does a patient who is beginning to experience that understand what's going on? I mean, do individuals, they really know that I seem to be losing it?
Yes. Because I do have some clients that are in what we call not early onset, like I talked about earlier, but they're just in the early stages of a dementia, usually Alzheimer's disease. And they will tell me that they know what's going on, or that today was more foggy than yesterday, or I'm starting to struggle with cooking, or I'm not as safe as I used to be, or I had to stop driving. So they can articulate it. However, the majority of people will not admit that they're having a cognitive problem or go and get a diagnosis. And so most of them are not talking freely about it like the small group that I do work with.
Right.
The majority of the population tries to hide it.
Got it.
Until they can no longer do that, and the family notices.
What are early indicators that you should
Well,
be thinking about? And I think this question, before you answer that, I'm posing this question from this perspective of what should I be considering for me? Not what am I looking for in somebody else? Because I think this is one of those things where if you reach a level of recognition that something is not right for you, then you can take action. And if you if you don't take action, I think that's one of the things that happens to a lot of us. This is an area that we don't want to talk about.
No.
This is scary stuff.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
the incident I told you about for me personally is like, oh my God.
Right.
You know, what does this mean? What's that going to happen? What's going to happen as I get older? I mean, it's
right.
But if you don't think about those things and you don't know what your options are, I think you are at a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what should somebody like me be thinking about?
Well, number one, tasks that you used to be able to do well and, you know, can't anymore. Within, I don't want to say suddenly can't do, but, you know, over the past year, all of a sudden you notice, I used to be able to do math in my head and I can't. Or my check register never balances anymore. I cannot get it to balance. These numbers are really hard for me.
Little things.
Little things. Or I'm really having a hard time doubling this recipe for Thanksgiving dinner.
Oh.
The three things that I look at when I'm working with a new client is the check register, cooking, and calendars.
Oh.
Because those are pretty high level things. The check register, you know, you got to balance, you got to do a lot of math and know how ending balances work and things like that. It's a higher level. Recipes, you got to kind of keep track of the boiling water and preheating the oven and then doubling the sugar and do I have enough butter and have I defrosted the butter? So there is a lot going on there too.
Right.
And then same thing with the calendar. There's a lot of squares. What square are we on today? And how do I keep track of which square I'm on today?
Right.
And where am I in the month? You know, so people will start to struggle with those things, those type of things. And then also just not being able to go back and solve things. That's a big one.
Not
like
solve things?
Solve a problem. Like if you come home or you go to leave and you can't find your keys and they're always on the key rack. And you've always hung your keys up on the key rack. And then someone with dementia, they're just going to stare at the key rack.
Oh.
They will not know how to find those keys.
Oh, okay.
And somebody who doesn't have dementia could say, oh, I had them last night when I opened the door and I was wearing my red coat and I'll check the pocket of my red coat and there they are.
Okay.
Because I can remember what I was wearing last night and when I last used them.
So problem
solving a problem
capabilities.
And,
Okay.
So things like that. And if you have any doubts, you just go to the doctor and the very best thing he would say, oh, you're fine.
There you go. That's the hope.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
And if he says you're not and he can give you treatment, you want to get treatment sooner rather than later. Because they can preserve a little bit about what you have now, where if we ignore it until our family notices and then they take us to the doctor, then yes, they'll preserve what I have in the future, but I would like to preserve what I got now.
Got it.
If possible.
Got it. Fantastic. Thank you for going over that. I think that's very helpful and useful. So now let's talk about some of the things that you had mentioned to me in a conversation too. There are, if someone is has this circumstance, there are certain environmental things that can act as either an irritant or a relaxant in terms of helping them cope with what's going on in their environment. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, definitely simplifying the environment will help someone with dementia. Not a lot of overwhelming patterns on sofas, patterns on carpets, you know, wallpaper. Some of those things can become to get a little agitating for someone with dementia because they can't get the depth perception and everything real well. So solid colors are best. Sometimes lighting plays a key factor. A lot of natural lighting is really good for them. Daylight, like 20 minutes of daylight in the morning, will help their sleep cycle. And noise. Some people with dementia become very noise sensitive. And there are things that we don't think about, like the gardener's blower. May really agitate somebody and get them really worked up, and we don't know why they're worked up because that's just a noise we don't register.
Right. So how do you figure those things out?
Well, you
Hit
just
and miss?
have to learn them. Hit and miss is one that families do, but and learning them, and also attending support groups. You learn a lot of information from, 6 or 10 other caregivers that are basically experts at doing this. They've been doing it, and you need to listen to them, and they'll give you tips.
Let's talk about caregivers for a moment. There's the possibility that a family member may feel obligated to be the primary caregiver for someone who's going through a circumstance like this. But there are also professional caregivers that are more trained in and have experience with the circumstances and the conditions. So, I mean, how do you know whether what do you tell the families?
I usually tell the families that, number one, it doesn't have anything to do with the person with dementia. It has to do with them. What are they comfortable with? And some people are not caregivers, It's like you didn't grow up and say, I want to be a dementia caregiver,
Right.
But if all of a sudden you were in that spot, you might say, okay, I'll do this. But it's not something that you chose. And so how long are you going to be able to do it and keep coping and doing a good job? We don't really know. So there's no right answer, whether it should be professional or family or the neighbor. It's whoever takes the best care and keeps the person safe and happy, the person with dementia safe and happy.
Right.
And that's really just the goal that I always keep in mind, keeping the person with dementia safe and happy.
Safe and happy.
Whoever is caring for them. And if the family member is not the appropriate person, that does not make them a bad person.
Right.
And if you need to move your family member into professional care, like assisted living or something like that, you are still a caregiver.
Sure.
You are still providing care. You are providing a place for them to get care. So I still call those people caregivers.
Cool. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So this is a condition that, we look at the boomer generation as being the generation for whom this is the most, one of the more central issues or concerns. And so I'm not sure what to do about this. Is an area I'm stumbling here. I'm not usually at a loss for words when I do my own TV show, but I'm stumbling a little bit here because I'm not exactly sure how to phrase the question that I have in my mind, which has to do with what do we in this generation need to think about here? I mean, we've talked about a few things here. Don't just hide it and go get, if you think there's something wrong, do something. But I don't know that people are really taking that to heart. So what's the old 2x4 that we need to hit people across the head with to get them to realize that this is something to think about now and not 3, 7, 10, 12 years from now when things could be really a problem?
Right. For themselves or for caring for somebody?
For them, either.
Okay. Well, that's a hard question, but you definitely want to put insurance in place that you will get care. Right. So there are actual insurance policies that I have seen some people with dementia really benefit from. Long-term care, things like that, and they're all different. So you really have to read them. You have to really take into account that it might be dementia, it might not be a physical disability.
Right.
And that oftentimes people with dementia are very physically fit. So,
Really?
Yeah, so it's not, they're on their feet and moving, we'll say that,
Okay.
and don't always know what is safe or not. So, people always think, if I need an insurance policy to take care of myself when I'm 90, it'll be because I'm in a nursing home in a wheelchair.
Right. Yeah.
Well, you might not be. You might be, only 91 and with dementia and up and walking, So just make sure that your insurance policy might cover you in your own home still. you know, and
So-
you can get a professional caregiver in or something like that. And I tell people to try and do a lot of walking now. You know, a lot of just blood flow to your brain. They talk about if there's just one thing you can do, it's walking.
So I guess that this is one of those kinds of things that unless the circumstance or the condition or an event pulls your attention directly into it, you really aren't gonna put a lot of attention on it. You know, but I think what you said about thinking forward in, you know, long care insurances and things like that, that's a smart move. I mean, a lot people will sit and they will look at what their financial plan is for the future. And what you're suggesting is that that should be part of your planning, you know, because you don't know what's going to happen. So consider it as one of the variables in your plan.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
A lot of people, when they talk about being disabled in the future, they're thinking physically
disability.
disabled.
Right.
Where, you know, of course, what I always think of is cognitively disabled,
Right.
which can be more expensive sometimes than a physical disability.
Right. Well, we're right about at the tail end of the first segment here. We've talked about a lot of stuff to try to set some orientation. When we come back for the next show, I want to talk more about the family dynamic, about what, because I think this is crucial. You know, what can people do? Because some of us, you know, that you're talking to here or that are in the audience are going to have a circumstance and they don't know how to deal with it. They don't know what to do for their family member. And I want to talk more about that when we come back. So thank you, Tiffany, for coming
You're
on
welcome.
Reference
Thank
Point.
you.
Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions for me, for Tiffany, or suggestions for other shows, send us an email at info@referencepointtv.com and we will address that. And we'll see you shortly when we do our next episode here on Reference Point. Thank you.